Hey everybody, Father Michael Revak here with St. Mary Magdalene. It's been a little while since we put out one of these, but today you're watching Essentials. Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to try to answer the question, not in an exhaustive way, but at least get started on the question, how do we know God, right? Because God, we know from Scripture, dwells in inaccessible light, right? So how do we know God? We can know just by human reason that there's a God, that God exists. We can understand just purely through human reason because God must be superlative, that there can only be one God, right? The Greeks came to this conclusion just by natural reason alone. But to know who God is, who is that one God, that's a thing that we can't do ourselves. God has to do it for us. We call that revelation of God's self to us, revelation, right? And revelation comes to us in two ways. God revealing himself to us comes through Scripture, Holy Scripture, and tradition, sacred tradition, okay? These two sources of revelation are the manner in which God, through humanity, has revealed himself. So he's inspired prophets and evangelists to write things that are true about who he is, and we know that that is inerrant, that that's true, that's accurate. If it's come to us through the Scriptures, we know that is a thing about God. We can know something about this God that we know must exist, but also through tradition. This would never have been an issue, like considering revelation in the Jewish culture, up until really the Protestant Reformation. This challenging of tradition as a source of revelation, because within the Old Covenant, Scripture and tradition went hand in hand in a seamless way, just as it did in the life of the church for 1,500 years. This segregation of tradition from as a source of revelation is really this kind of relatively new thing, because God reveals himself through the life of the worshiping community and the way that worship develops. And that's all part of cult or culture, which forms tradition, right? So you've got Scripture and tradition being the source of how God reveals himself to us. This is the how God is showing. But how we see is always kind of a hit or miss sort of thing, because we're all individual human beings. We all have different levels of understanding, capacity to know, attention spans, even the willingness to pursue knowledge and to discover. But we also have different experiences, life experiences. We can be badly hurt sometimes, like a person who has been badly hurt by their mother, or particularly their father, might receive the revelation that God is Father in a way that a person who had a loving father might never consider receiving it that way, right? So there needs to be an interpreter for the revelation. And that, my friends, is what we call the Magisterium of the Church. And so these three pillars, Scripture and tradition, governed and interpreted by the Magisterium of the Church, is sort of the vehicle or the method by which God reveals himself to us as a particular person with particular characteristics. We can know who God is, and that's a wonderful thing. We can't know who God is because we've discovered him. We can discover that God is. But to know who God is, that has to be a thing that he shares with us. And so we can't argue or quibble about who he is, because he's the one who tells us who he is, any more than we could argue or quibble with somebody who says to you, this is who I am. Let me tell you something about myself. We can't just turn around then and say, no, that's not true. That's not you. No, we have to take a person at their word, and God cannot lie. So when he tells us something about himself, that's true. But there's a sending and there's a receiving. The sending is something that God certainly does in an inerrant way through Scripture and tradition, but there's also that receiving. How we receive things as individuals is so variable that it can distort the sending of the revelation of God. And so there is a method that God establishes by which we can receive the revelation of himself in the way that we can be sure he wants us to receive it. And that comes through the teaching efforts of the church's magisterium. So how do we know who God is? Well, we know who God is through revelation. That revelation comes to us through scripture and through tradition. And these two things that cannot be separated, they are wed together, one not over the other, but living in a harmony. And they are then communicated to us in a universally applicable way through the magisterium of the church. And so, living a life within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, we can be sure that the ability to know God accurately, truly, really, and in a way that the knowledge changes and turns into love is assured for us. I hope that wasn't too confusing. But that was a question that was asked to me. How do we really know God, and how can we be sure that we know who God is? And this is the answer. No reason to be atheist, because we can know that God is by pure human reason. Now we can see that there's no reason to ever say that we're agnostic, that we can't know anything about God, because we can. He's revealed it to us, and we have a way of receiving what he's revealed through the church. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time.